First of all, Eric, thanks a ton for doing this. I have had the fortune of working with you and learning from you over many years. In many cases, you were the one who mentored me into the world of instructional design, specifically backward design, and how we can put that into a process. I still remember something that you said back then, make the process simple enough so that people follow it. If you create a very complex process, people are going to bypass it. So all those pieces, nuggets of wisdom stay with me even today. And I thought that this could be a great opportunity of passing it on to a much bigger audience through this particular podcast. And we will try and send this out to as many people as possible. There are a lot of people I see who are interested in building a career in learning, and they don't know where to start or they don't know what to rely on. And in many cases, they start with what they see around them and they pick those as best practices. And you and I both know that in many cases they may not be the best practice, they may be the in thing for that particular day. So we will try and cover all of this through this particular conversation. But before I jump into my questions, just for our audience to know who you are, Eric, and you have been in the learning world for many, many years. I'm not going to get into the decade side of it, but many, many years. You have a PhD in educational technology, and the most recent role, and correct me if I'm wrong, the most recent role that you were in was you were the design leader in Ernst& Young, their global learning team, and you retired from there. I'll take a pause over here if I misrepresented anything or anything that you would like to add.
No, you have it just right, Pravasi. That's a good accurate description.
Perfect. In that case, Eric, we'll dive into the questions, and I'll start from what I was referring to. There are a lot of instructional designers, or for that matter, just learning professionals who want to learn a bit more about design, and they want to do it the right way. However, they don't know where to start. So, given your extensive experience, and you have done a lot of work as well as research on that front, what would be some of your key instructional design or learning design principles that you would recommend that all learning professionals should rely on so that they are in a very safe space when they're building something?
Yeah, well, to start with, how many hours do we have to answer that question? If I had to boil it down to say three principles that I would encourage all designers, all fledgling designers, new designers to think about, to work on, I'd probably start with practice. And I'm referring to encouraging learners to practice, setting up opportunities for learners to practice. Often, especially with new designers, they get the information and they want to package that and they want to push it out. And the practice becomes sort of an afterthought. They know, oh, we instinctively, yeah, maybe we should have a little practice on this, and maybe they'll add a little bit at the end. But really, you should be thinking about practice from the very beginning. Well, actually, you should be thinking about your overall objectives. But that almost the very next thing you should think of in backward design is how are they going to practice this skill? How are they going to show themselves and how are they going to show the instructor and each other that they're starting to master this skill? And that comes in practice. And so there are lots and lots of different ways to encourage practice in a classroom situation. You can do that more easily in some cases. When it comes to e-learning, I think designers sometimes say, gee, I can't really think of a good way to practice this skill with a computer, in front of a computer. How do you do that? And it can be more challenging doing that. But if you examine the cognitive processes that you're trying to get this learner to adopt, And you will be able to find some ways to put that into an e-learning situation. For instance, asking them about the decisions they're making, or ask them amongst these three or four choices, what decision would you make? And that would guide the learner to make that decision. These days, too, with the advent of I think it's getting closer, if not already there, that we're able to have learners practice with a chat bot on screen, say for a lot of soft skills that we couldn't previously do. And so that really opens up a whole new world to us as designers in instructional design. The second one I would choose, the second evidence-based learning principle might be around presentation and displays. Why do I say this? Uh, we've all sat down at training sessions where the displays, what's on the screen or in front of us, is just awful, right? We've seen very wordy slides that increase the cognitive load of the learner. The learner is trying to take in this new information from a fire hose and is reading 100 words on a screen while the instructor, meanwhile, is saying some other words. And now we've got this cognitive, well, dissonance of confusion, trying to figure out, what do I pay attention to, the instructor or all these words? Do I read them? Very difficult. I would recommend highly that new instructional designers that you mentioned before, Pravasi, go out and buy the latest edition, the latest copy of a book called E-Learning and the Science of Instruction, because it bottles up all the key principles that displays should have, whether it's e-learning, whether it's in a classroom, whatever. It talks about the presentations that are in front of the learner wherever they are happen to be learning. And I would go out and buy a copy of that book. The third evidence-based principle I would recommend, I think, is something that is often forgotten by instructional designers, and that's learner motivation. So what can you bake into the learning that's going to address the learner's motivation? I wouldn't downplay the importance of that, because if learners get into a situation where something looks too easy, they're going to get bored and they're going to check out. They're going to stop attending. If it's too difficult, they're going to feel discouraged and they're going to check out. And either way, you're not going to have their full attention. So you really need to address that question of learner confidence. I think you have to address the question of learner relevance too. Why is this, and you need to keep coming back to this, why is this relevant to you, the learner, and your job? And how is this going to fit into your job? Part of motivation too is being positive, having positive, upbeat learning sessions in good social settings that are fun, yes, but also stimulating and challenging, and something that the learner is really going to want to do. So I would always try to remember learner motivation in the learning.
Perfect. And just extending that question into something that, again, I see a lot, and I think you would have seen it much more. There are practices which many are following today, which either do not have any scientific background or foundation, or they have been actively proven to be not so useful tool to support learning. One of the principles, or one of the pieces that you and I have spoken about in the past, is the learning styles. Everyone talks about it, and it's still being spoken about, even though there is so much literature out there. So in your experience and based on your reading as well as what you have seen in the learning world, what would be your recommendation for organizations to build a learning process, system, culture that is grounded in evidence and not aligned to the myths which are floating around?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are so many learning myths out there, right? And I see why. We all see why. We see some what we call the bright shiny object, or in other parlance, we see a squirrel going across the street and it grabs our attention. We'll see things sometimes at learning conferences that look appealing, but when you dig down under the surface, they're not rooted in the science. An example of this is I came across some learning recently where they wanted the learner to, it was in e-learning, and they wanted the learner to um, take on sort of a first-person shooter role and shoot their way into a classroom. And they spent a lot of time and a lot of money doing that. But it really didn't have any impact on the learning. It may have been kind of fun, kind of gamey, but it really didn't increase the learner's knowledge. And so you can spend a lot of money and a lot of time doing things like that. How do you avoid it? That's the question. I, I would start by saying that the L&D, the learning and development team that works for any particular company, whether they're full-time employees or whether they're consultants or contractors, should have some L&D credentials, some creds behind them. That means they have gone through some good amount of formal instruction in learning science. And not only that, but that they follow it up by regular reading of the science of in journals and attending scholarly presentations and so forth to really stay up on what is the science saying and catching up on the latest and greatest that the front of science is pushing. And I think the reason I mention that is that sort of gets the learning team, the L&D team into the door and to get their foot in the door. And from there, then they start building credibility with the leadership of a company and promoting learning science and trying to dissuade those in leadership positions from going down a path of spending money and time on learning that doesn't have a basis, doesn't have a scientific basis. Once that's done, that credibility is built, then the L&D team, I think, also needs to fairly early and often push this idea and remind everyone of the power of learning science. And they can do that with lunch and learns. They can do that as part of small mini sessions or just in everyday conversation with the leadership of that organization. And then something that we've used for years, and Pravasi, you were part of this in a couple of organizations, and that is using a design checklist. We found that that is such a valuable tool. If the learning design checklist is based on the science, and you take every course that is either being built or has already been built, and you subject it to that checklist, and you rate each of the items according to how they perform or how they seem. It's amazing that learning designers all want to have the best score on that learning checklist. They all want to get good marks. And so it kind of, it's a process that sort of feeds itself, I think, that people more and more want to use the checklist, which is built on science. So then the learning that gets built in that organization gets better and better. And then the checklist gets held up as this thing that people aspire to. But, hey, look, we have a course built on the learning science. And it becomes a mark of pride, I think, for designers in that company.
Absolutely. On the checklist front, there were two pieces that when I look back and when I started using the checklist that stand out for me. One is it not only helps you identify what's missing, but it highlights what you are providing, which is a lot more than what you desired to. So it forces you to contain your content and align it to what you wanted to teach. Otherwise, specifically if we are working with SMEs, they have this tendency to let's push this as well in. If we are doing this, why not add this? And it just keeps going back to your earlier point. The cognitive overload is dangerous from a learner's perspective, and the checklist helped a lot of designers just streamline it and stay focused on what we wanted to achieve. So that was one. The other one, which was a very interesting and a very sort of involved exercise, was if you, at least we used to do it a lot in the first few years, was having those conversations. So a particular course gets reviewed by multiple designers. They give the course a score, and then all of them get together and they discuss their scores and the reasons why they scored something on a certain parameter. And that was such a huge learning curve for me, because I could hear what another perspective from a designer, and then that just added to my own knowledge base, and that was brilliant for me as a designer. So absolutely in agreement that checklist can be a game changer. Sort of brings structure to the entire design team.
That's a good point. It's structure. It's not just people sort of arguing for points or for their own course, say, but they've got something solid to look at and to anchor themselves to that, and it gives everyone the same guidepost. I agree.
Absolutely. And one other piece that you referred to earlier, and again, something that you and I worked on a long time back, the coaching piece that you spoke about, and how AI can help in there. So I'm currently exploring a few of those platforms where the claim is that the tool or the platform itself can act as a coach. Still to see something or someone as good as a life coach. But what I'm really excited about is the conversational simulations that we typically used to build, and they used to take months to build one, right? To the branching scenarios, and somebody makes a decision. This is how that conversation flows from that particular decision. That what I've seen is the overall life cycle of that project has reduced because of AI. So I've seen cases where AI is able to draft an initial storyboard, and then you can, of course, as a designer, you can make changes to it. But also the graphics part of it. The other day I saw, I gave a branching scenario to someone, and I think within a day or maximum probably 48 hours, they came back with a working version of an e-learning, where it wasn't live videos or of humans, but it was animated. But the animations were very good. They didn't sound like those machine recorded audios that we used to have 10 years back. These were very close to real people. So I was quite impressed, and I was wondering if we had it back then. Probably we would have reduced the overall project cycle to 50%.
Right. Yeah.
Perfect. We have spoken about evidence-based learning a lot, and the whole idea of evidence-based learning is that it is grounded in scientific principles, which have been proven through observations, data, experiments, etc. Um, can you share a few examples of where you have used it and you felt that, okay, it had a huge impact on the learning outcome, specifically in the business world?
Hmm. Oh yeah. Well, there are quite a few examples. The first one that pops into my mind is when designers use a certain kind of task analysis known as CTA or cognitive task analysis. And that's a method of talking to subject matter experts to glean from them what they really do. Not what they tell you that they do, but what they really do. And sometimes those two are different. because people tend to automate when they become experts, they automate the work that they do so much so that it's even invisible to them. They don't know what they know, and they're unable to tell you in a normal conversation. But the technique behind cognitive task analysis really digs down deep and asks probing questions of these subject matter experts. And it leads to some fascinating insights and some great results. So some of the big results that have come out have been done by a number of researchers. Dick Clark was one of the early founders of CTA and proponents of CTA. And they found, Dick and colleagues found that it worked extremely well in a medical school environment where they're trying to find the procedures, say, that a surgeon uses in actual medical practice. And instead of just taking what the surgeon writes down that they do, actually watching that surgeon perform their duties and then listening to them and pulling out the step by steps of not only what they're doing, but how they made those decisions. And by doing that, they were able to increase the value, the efficacy of medical school instruction. So those were great. We did this in a for-profit education company that I was associated with back a few years ago. We were looking at career counselors, career service advisors, and we used a CTA-like process to pull out what they really did. And then we watched them in their work, came up with all the objectives and the learning based on that. And when we turned that into instruction, it led to, I believe, a 15% increase in, they were focused on job placements. So a 15% increase in job placements, which was quite significant for them. So I can't say enough about CTA. It's not an easy skill. It's not something you just read about and go do, but but I think it also tells us that good task analysis, good upfront work, it will pay dividends. Another real world example is from a colleague that I worked with for years, and she looked at in especially in doing front end analysis in trying to figure out what to train. She looked at top performers versus average performers. If you're trying to figure out what do I teach people? What's the most important thing? She looked at who are the top performers and how do they differ from the average performer? And once you can glean that, once you can pull that out, you can then find those key ingredients. And now you know what to teach, what to train. And by doing this, she worked for a large IT company that was able to improve in this case, they were looking at sales training, and improve the quality of their sellers and to perform the training in half the time that they normally did. So not only can you increase the output, but also decrease the time. And of course, time is money, right? We want to we want to have learners in the classroom as little as possible, really, so they can get out there and do their job and work for the company, do what the company has them do. So that's a method of really sort of the front end analysis of learning design. Since I mentioned motivation before, I'll tell you about a study that we did where we had a classroom situation, but in that classroom, it was sort of a blended learning, and there was a lot of opportunity for students and instructors to communicate back and forth via email and via surveys and quizzes. And we were really looking at the motivation of those students. Did they think it was too hard, too easy? Were they motivated? Were they finding it relevant to what they were doing? Were they struggling? And we looked at that, but also their practice scores or test scores along the way. And all that data got fed up to the instructor, and the instructors could then look on a dashboard every day and say, here are my students. These ones are doing really well. These ones here aren't doing so well. And so we provided those instructors with responses, templated responses. Now, the instructors could change those if they wanted, but at least we tried to make it easy for them, saying, for your students who are struggling and who have low motivation, we suggest sending them an email with this kind of wording. And so they did that, and the instructors were able to really keep the pulse of the class. They really knew what was going on, not just in their performance, but in their motivation. And we achieved some great results from that. So there's a case of motivation in practice actually improving the learning.
Perfect. And you gave me an idea for one of the podcasts, which is cognitive task analysis. I'll probably catch hold of Kat to be a guest for that. But coming back to the motivation piece, and earlier you also spoke about relevance. So a recent research that we did, it's already published. What we found is amongst four parameters that learners typically look at when they want to learn, relevance and more specifically how learning can improve their performance was the biggest indicator of, or the strongest indicator of someone learning something or transferring that particular skill to their on-job environment. So absolutely, it's something and what's interesting, Eric, is given that I've been looking at research more in the last few years, there is so little which is available in the workplace environment compared to if you look at what's there in higher education space. But these are not similar. A lot of people claim that education, which is higher education, is fairly your learner profile is similar. However, what they forget is the triggers and the constraints of a working professional are very different from someone who is going to college or even further, right? I go to college, my primary objective is to learn. When I go to work, learning is probably the 101st item on my priority list. So the constraints are of very different nature. And that's probably the reason what we found was if learners are able to draw a line and link a learning object to improve performance, their tendency to learn it and transfer the skill was much, much higher.
Yeah, that's so true. I once worked with a leader, a learning leader, who said our primary job is to make people successful in their jobs. And who doesn't want to be successful in their job, right? It leads to promotions and better pay and more satisfaction. And so anything we can do in the design of that learning that can make them successful, the better. And to your point, to do it in less time because they simply don't have a lot of extra time to dedicate to learning.
Absolutely. And if we can stay on that, because we are talking about performance and we are talking about associated growth, which is based on learning, performance, and growth. Uh, what can learning and development teams do so that they can sort of encourage retention and application? Because we see a lot of cases where people come, they attend training, they go back and they never use those skills. So, where is the chain breaking? What can L&D teams do?
Yeah, I think part of this goes back to what we talked about before around practice. Because if someone can practice repeatedly in class, practice in a variety of contexts, practice by integrating different concepts together, different skills together, that they're more likely to do that back on their job. On the flip side of that, though, we've seen a lot of bad training, right? Where they say, well, we're just going to give you the information and hopefully you'll practice it when you get back on the job. And so get ready, set, go. Here's all the information. And then they slam it down the learner's throat, give them lots of reading, lots of thousands of PowerPoint slides and no practice. And they go back to their job and they say, well, I don't really know. It's good stuff. It was good information, but I don't know how to apply it to my job without that practice. So I would encourage that not only whole task practice, but also part task practice. So they talk about if you can break a skill down into its subsequent parts and then practice little bits of those parts, the part task, practice, practice, practice little bits, and then gradually glue those subtasks or parts together into whole task practice. So now you're doing the whole job really, or the whole skill, I should say, from end to end. Another place that I think can really help learners to apply what they've learned relies very strongly on the line manager. Why? Because the line manager is with those workers a lot, right? May not be with them every day, but certainly has a lot more contact with learners back on the job. And they're talking about the job. Maybe the line manager is observing that person doing the job. So if you bring the line manager in and let them know what the training was, what it was intended to do, what the support materials are, what the goals and the objectives of it were, I think you have a better chance of having that line manager be able to support and reinforce what was learned in during the learning class, if the class being an event. But that event can live on with, I think, with the help of a line manager who buys into the process. Now, that's not an easy thing. It's not easy because line managers, like the line worker, they've got a lot to do. They've got a lot on their plate. But if you can establish good credibility and trust with those line managers, and they understand that what you're training truly will lead to success of their workers, and that will lead to success of the overall organization, then you have a force multiplier, as some people call it, out in the learning space and keep the learning going. I would also say that in the design of the learning, you got to be very careful that the process that you're training is the same process that is being used out in the real world. I've seen lots of instances where they had a process that somebody in the organization was pushing, but it wasn't the process everyone was
Yeah.
using. And so you try to teach a different process. Now you say, okay, now go back to your job and do this. But the line manager doesn't support that process. Maybe the compensation plan doesn't support that process. The chance of that person doing that process probably is less. I'll give you a great example of this happened in an organization I was in years ago. It was with a major telecoms company that was selling wireline services and wireless services, that is mobile phone plans. And they wanted to train a wireline plan to the sales groups out there. And it was a very difficult process, took a lot of steps. It was very complex, and it wasn't rewarded particularly well. And so, but the learning and development team took it on. They said, sure, we can do it. We can train anything. Give us your most complex thing. And they did, and they trained it. They did a good job training it. And in the tests that followed during at the very end of training, the learners passed, so they showed they could do it. And yet, when they got out in their job, they weren't selling this really complex thing. And so management came back and said, well, the training failed. No, it didn't. They could do it when you forced them to. They knew how to do it. But the fact is they just weren't getting compensated very well, and their instinct took over, and they said, well, gee, this thing is really hard and I don't get paid anything for it, and this thing is really easy to sell and I get paid a lot for it, guess which one they chose? So there was not good alignment there. And this is a great place where the learning and development team really should have addressed it right up front with management and says, we've got to change something here in either the process, the compensation, or something else to make this successful for everybody. It's not just that learning was successful, it has to be successful for the whole organization.
That's such a great point, Eric. Two pieces that stand out. One, support from work environment and specifically supervisory support. And there are enough and more papers, literature out there which show that these are really crucial for transfer of skills to happen. But a point that comes out of it, and you highlighted it through the example, is training is not an isolated event. It has to blend into the larger culture and the ecosystem. Now, if the ecosystem doesn't support what you're training, then the outcomes will not be favorable. And in many cases, as it happened in this case, training team gets a bad name that you didn't do a good job. Uh, Partially, I would also put the onus on the training team because they too should have proactively probably spoken to stakeholders and got the ecosystem ready, which a lot of teams even today do not do. And probably I'll talk about, or that's one of the questions that I have for you. By the way, Eric, when I spoke to some of my people in network that I'm talking to you, and this will be a podcast, it was sort of crowdsourcing of questions for me, which I put a post-it over here. I'm trying to ensure that most of the questions which were very often repeated by people get covered. I may not get an opportunity very often to talk to you, so I'm trying to tick those off the list. But the next one is in line with that. Uh, what is it that L&D teams they should be doing, or they shouldn't be doing, so that they can get buy-in from senior stakeholders, and specifically when it comes to measurement of learning, what is it that they should be reporting back? And over here, I'm looking at what is business interested in, from
Mm.
a measurement perspective.
Yeah, measurement has been a bugaboo for a long time. I think partly because not only management, senior management, but also L&D organizations themselves have often measured learning activity or training activity. How many butts and seats have we gotten? How many hours of training have we accomplished? How many web pages have we produced? So it's training as activity. And to your point, focusing on learning as an event. How many events have we held? And so my last example just shows you how an event doesn't actually help you, and it doesn't tie you back to the learners once they're on the job. But it's easy to measure, right? So I get it. I understand why people do that. It's easy to measure, so they do that. But the sort of the second phase of that, or the second problem is focusing on learner satisfaction only, and we've seen that a lot. Well, they liked it, and that's good. I mean, and sometimes it's the only thing you've got. And if you want to compare, say, a course with a revised course, and the revised course they liked so much better, and maybe they hung around longer and there was less absenteeism and people stuck through the course throughout the entire course. That can lead to good outputs. But again, focusing solely on satisfaction doesn't tell you if folks have actually learned. So you try to address those higher stages, right? Was there learning that occurred? So you have practice and you have valid, really good valid tests in the course. And then of course, if we're thinking about the Kirkpatrick model of evaluation, we'd really like to know what this training did for the overall organization, for its bottom line, for how we really move the needle on accomplishing or accomplishing business objectives, which is really what it's all about. It's why business can afford to pay the overhead of learning and development teams. So, but going back to satisfaction for a moment, we also, even in long classes, we tend to throw out a satisfaction survey at the very end of the course. And maybe learners, well, maybe they're scrambling for the door, they're trying to get home, maybe they're catching a flight, or they're just getting to their job. They've got too many emails that they haven't addressed. So they quickly fill out the survey and they leave. A better way to handle that is to have surveys throughout the course. So you can have one a daily survey, or you can even sometimes even have a half daily survey, a little mini survey that I think gives you a better idea of what went on in the course, especially if it's a long one, or especially if it's a course that's a blended learning, say, where there's various piece parts of it, some independent study, some lectures, some social learning time, then survey all along the way to make sure that it's working the way you think it should be working. I think again, and part of this, going back to the line managers, and if you can work with line managers to do this, to try to measure people in their job after they've gone through the learning. In some cases, like one of those examples I mentioned with career service advisors, they looked at their calls with the students that they were interacting with. They actually took those and transposed them and looked at to see, are they using the skills that they learned in the class or not? And the ones that had been were actually doing better. So if you really want to measure, go into their workplace and use the methods that they are acceptable, whether it's videotaping them or audio taping them. They do this frequently in call centers, right? They say this call is being recorded for training purposes. Well, one of those training purposes sometimes is to really listen and make sure that they're mastering or that they have mastered the skills that they learned in training. That's one of the best ways to do it. But again, going back to the beginning of our question here, um, all of this is to try to measure learning not as an event, but as an ongoing evolution, I think, in the life of a worker.
And a lot of pieces that you spoke about, and if I can specifically focus on recording and analyzing, and also you spoke about the fact that it should be aligned to business objectives, getting buy-in. Uh, One of the key challenges that a lot of learning professionals talk about is that they don't get enough support from business, and or business says that, okay, they have a lot on their plate and they cannot take this on. Um, any best practices that you can share which makes such kind of measurement where business objectives are being looked at a bit more practical, so that there is more partnership with the business stakeholders on that?
Yeah, that's such a good question and such a hard thing to do, but that shouldn't dissuade us from trying, I think. Um, I would start by going back to what I said earlier about maintaining your credibility and your trust and establishing trust with senior leadership. I would say it's important for the leadership of the L&D team to get invited to the table where where corporate business objectives are being discussed and really be able to suss out what those mean. So talking to business leaders and saying, okay, I see this business objective. What would be a good way to measure this? How can we measure it to where you're feeling comfortable, Mr. or Mrs. Business Leader, with that we've trained it correctly, that the learning has worked. I think that's really important. Um, I think also if you can, incorporating objectives, what would ultimately be the learning objectives, incorporating those into the performance review process, right? So there was an old saying, you measure you measure what you get, what gets measured gets performed. If every year you have a performance review process that is completely separate from what the person has learned or what's completely separate from business objectives, then they're going to do whatever they're a learner is going to do whatever they have to do in order to do well in their performance objective so that they rise to the top and get paid more and all those good things. But if we can somehow incorporate what they're learning into their performance objective measures, metrics, then guess what? I think they will also strive then to hit those metrics. And then those two things are mutually supportive, the performance objective process, the learning process. And that's a tough one to get done. But again, if the L&D team is worth its salt, and if the L&D team is truly a business partner, then I think that they might try that approach with senior leadership to get it done. Um, another way I think of really building a culture of learning, of getting people to adopt new and improve business processes is to trumpet the achievers, to really hold up those people who have gone through the learning programs and done well and taken that back to their job. So one of the examples that we see of that is in a badging system, right? Where people have certain learning objectives that they want to follow. Um, we create learning opportunities all along the way. Maybe it's blended learning, maybe it's e-learning, maybe it's instructional, maybe it's just reading on their own. But when they've achieved that, then they get a badge, and the organization then holds them up as a model, saying, "Look at Pravasi and look at the badges that he has aspired to and that he achieved, and he's gone above and beyond." And that shows other people, I think, in the organization that the company values that. And even though it's hard, as we already mentioned, right? You've got a job to do. You've got things that you have to do that aren't learning. Um, if you get lauded for, if you get rewarded for, called out for your learning success and achievements, then I think you're more likely to do that and to build a culture of learning along the way.
Absolutely. Badges is very close to my heart. You know that for obvious reasons. I actually took that idea and I implemented it in my next organization after EVA, and it worked very well. Um, One of the things that you also spoke about was somehow associate learning outcomes with the performance and bring it into the performance metric. Um, Something that I experimented with and it gave a good output or outcome was in my last organization, one of the CXOs was very supportive of learning initiatives, had a strong belief that learning sits at the core of their business. It took me 8 months to drive that conversation and convince him, but once he was convinced, he convinced the other CXOs, and we were able to bring in an incentive system which was purely driven by learning, and we saw exponential growth in learners wanting to learn more. So from my team used to struggle and they used to complain that people are not coming in for training, to a point wherein we found that we had almost doubled the hours of learning, and not just that, but the impact on business. We were able to do that, probably for a different conversation. I know you are based in the US, West Coast. This is late night for you, so I will not stretch the call beyond the scheduled time. Probably the last question, Eric, and this is something that I heard from a lot of people, specifically people who are in senior positions within L&D. Constantly asking how can they position the L&D team as well as a business case in front of very senior leaders to get buy-in. And buy-in can be, or they have mentioned in different parameters, getting budget for something, getting buy-in that they release people to attend training. How should L&D, specifically senior leaders within L&D, do this with very senior business leaders? And also, if you could talk about where do people usually go wrong when they're doing this?
Yeah, those two are really intermingled, aren't they? I think, and this goes back to maybe some of the other questions that we talked about earlier, but I think we have to be very aware of what senior leadership in a company is trying to do. And as an L&D team, we have to prove to them a lot on a daily basis that we are a business partner with them and that we're going to learn that business very quickly. So one of the places where this comes up is in interviewing of or appointing of delegating subject matter experts, right? Companies say, okay, you want me to give you the best subject matter expert I've got. Take that person offline. They're not doing their job while they're talking to you, and who knows how long you're going to be spending with them. Prove to me that this is a good expense. Well, if you don't use their time wisely, you're going to drag that subject matter expert down. You're going to keep them off the job a lot longer. You as the L&D team and the L&D leaders need to be very quick study and be right in there, prepared, ready to ask questions, ready to ask the right questions and targeted, and be very efficient with that subject matter expert's time. I've seen cases where that hasn't happened. I've seen cases where the L&D team sits there and uses a lot of instructional design verbiage and tries to snow them with various terminology and it doesn't work. It really doesn't, and it takes time away from what they're really trying to do. I talked earlier about cognitive task analysis. The only way that CTA works is if that instructional designer is very sharp and has done all the background homework that they can before they go and interview those SMEs. So we do have to prove that we're going to use their time wisely. We also have to show that we're going to use learner time wisely. I think I've mentioned this already, and I apologize if it sounds like a broken record, but we have to come up with techniques where we're going to use the least amount of learner time to train the same skill as someone else, because that we simply don't want to take those learners out of the classroom for that long. So, again, we've all seen examples where that doesn't happen and where we waste time. But again, our mission is to make learners successful. That's our raison d'etre. It's the only reason why we're there is to make that learner more successful at their job. And the better we can do that, and the better we can prove that, and have the reputation that we do that, then the more latitude, I think, and the better relationship that L&D is going to have with senior leadership. And at the same time, I mean, circling this all the way back as almost a bookend, we also need to show that we're not going to train with shiny objects. We're going to train and have learning activities that are built on the science, because that again is the most effective and most efficient. We'll use learner time and SME time more efficiently, and just be better business partners. I hope that answered it.
Perfect. I think not just did it answer the question, but as you rightly said, it bookmarked the entire conversation. We, I think, have had It's the top of the hour, and it's it's always a pleasure talking to you, Eric. And I hope we can do this a lot more. But for this particular conversation, thanks a ton once again. Um, the wisdom that you have, which you have gathered over the years, is something that is sort of your legacy, and you pass it on to me. I'm now trying to it's not a CTA, but sort of taking out the expertise in you and trying to send it out to the larger world. So thanks a ton for doing this for us, and hope you have a good rest of your evening.
You're welcome, Pravasi. It's been my pleasure talking with you. Thank you.